Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hi, Layne.
Hi, hello everybody.
So friends, we are so glad you dropped in here today. And if you've never been here before, my name is Lisa Mason Ziegler, and I am joined here by Layne Angelo. Layne is the seed manager here at the Gardener's Workshop, and I'm kind of the bottle washer here at the Gardener's Workshop. And this podcast is actually brought to you by the Gardener's Workshop. So Layne, why don't you take it away for today's episode?
All right, so today is going to be one of our Seed Talk Express episodes, one of our shorter format episodes, and we are going to be talking about a topic we are getting a lot of questions about these days, and it is troubleshooting your cool flowers plant size. So some people are having issues with their plants getting too large before winter or even trying to bloom before winter, and everyone is wondering what exactly to do. So we are going to go through that. Should we get started, Lisa?
Yes, let's do it.
All right. Okay, so the first question is, if we really want to give our plants a head start next spring, why not plant even earlier than 6 to 8 weeks before our first expected fall frost? So this is talking about fall planting. That is one of the recommended timeframes that you can plant your cool flowers that are hardy in your zone. But why not plant even earlier than that, Lisa?
So that is just such a great question. And we find that when people are overzealous and really excited about finding out about cool flowers, this is a frequent problem. So what the purpose of fall planting is to plant 6 to 8 weeks before your first expected frost, so that those plants have just enough time, or the seed to sprout into a baby plant, or for the plants that you plant to just get well established before winter conditions really come in. The point is that when your winter hits, you want your plant to be well established so that it can just hunker down and go dormant once the cold temperatures come. If you plant even earlier than that 6 to 8 week window, which is as Layne said, a frequent problem that people struggle with sometimes, what happens is your plant actually gets too big before it has to go through winter. Smaller, more compact plants with less vegetative growth can go dormant and kind of protect their own, if you want to think of it that way, when they're small. But when you start getting plants that are 10, 12, 18 inches and beyond, that vegetation is just going to take a lot of damage from the cold temperature. Dormancy doesn't really work very, very well for that, as well as you just have a lot of vegetation that's exposed to freezing cold, wind whipping weather.
Yes. So you want them to grow just enough to get well established, but not so much that they're going to be more susceptible to the cold damage of the winter.
Right.
All right, let's move on to the next question. So what is the ideal plant size going into winter? This is obviously going to vary for different plants, but in general, what are you looking for as a good plant size going into the winter?
Sure. And so that is another great question. Just the other day, we were out doing a project in the garden with all the cool flowers, and I just kept saying, oh my gosh, they're perfect size to go through winter. You want them, I always recommend that you plant like a 3 to 5 inch transplant. And you want to direct seed in time to kind of grow that same size plant as it goes into winter. Because the plants aren't really going to do any vegetative growth, you hope, through the winter. That may happen if you get some warmish type days. But I would say closer to that 5 to 7 inches is really a great size to go through winter, because the top of that plant is really an anchor for the plant. I mean, that's what really kind of just holds it there and lets the roots do their job below ground level. So I would say probably the 5 to 7 inch by the time they've gotten well established and they're going into winter.
And when do you notice them kind of pausing that top growth? After you originally plant them or direct seed, you'll notice them growing, obviously, and then it will kind of pause. When do you notice that happening typically?
Sure. So that really kind of happens when you start dipping down for us here below 30. And it kind of staying that way. The problem here where I live in southeastern Virginia is we'll have some 20-degree nights, and then all of a sudden you'll have a run of 55 to 70-degree days. And so the plants will grow during that period. But a perfect world, and the way it used to be when I first started growing cool flowers 20 years ago, was you would put your garden to bed at Thanksgiving, cover them if you needed to, and they would just be the same size when you uncovered them in February or March. But that's not necessarily the case now. So below freezing temperatures and kind of hanging there puts the plants into dormancy and holds them there, but they can very quick, which is actually a benefit of the cool flowers, is that they quickly pop out of dormancy in very early spring and start growing. That's why you get better plants, you get earlier blooms, but that can also work against you if you kind of have crazy warm weather coming and going throughout the winter.
Yes. All right. Let's discuss what you might need to do if you are experiencing too much growth on your plants going into winter. So warm weather has lasted longer than expected this fall, and I'm worried my plants are getting too big heading into winter. How can I slow down their growth? So can you talk about, in terms of watering, fertilizer, row cover, and pinching, some things you should do or shouldn't do when it comes to these plants?
Sure. So, if you are experiencing fall-like conditions that will not stop, like that's what happens to us. Fall's supposed to end about mid-November, but let's just say you're still having warm days and your plants look beautiful if it was February or March, but it's not, right? So the things that we do to kind of stall the plants, you can definitely manipulate plants. It's not as easy to do once they're planted out in the garden as it is if you've got them in a tray, then you just haven't planted them yet. But I would definitely go easy on any watering. We don't really do much irrigating here in the winter because we have such rain so often. Definitely don't overwater. I do not feed at all during the winter at all. We don't start feeding or offering any kind of liquid fertilizer until regrowth starts, like the 6 to 8 week window before your last spring frost, when stuff is starting to grow. And the other thing is, if you're using row covers, definitely do not keep them covered on warm days. You don't want to kind of be cuddling them and helping them to grow. Now that's different if you planted late and you're trying to get them rooted in, and you're having to kind of help them along. You would definitely not want to do that if the plants were growing more than you desired them to. Pinching induces growth. So I tend to not pinch. Oftentimes, particularly with Sweet William. Sweet William is so famous to just send up a rogue stem and start blooming. If you just leave it, that's what I do. And if you pinch it, that's saying to the plant, grow more stems. And so you may potentially, depending on how your weather's going, you might actually start growing even more stems. And if you did that and then you pinched again, you can over pinch. When you pinch too much, then you start getting lots of puny little stems instead of 5 or 6 really great stems. So I don't pinch anything because it's blooming. If we have the occasional, plant that's doing that. If I was going to pinch a plant, if I felt the need, if it was really too tall or something, I would wait until cold weather sets in so you don't induce more growing. You kind of wait until they're dormant before you do that.
Yes. Okay, now let's talk about one step further than that. And this question is, help, my fall planted plants are trying to bloom before winter. What should I do? And do I need to scrap this bed entirely? So what if someone has snapdragons and they are actually about to bloom? What should they do in that case?
Well, if you planted so early that your snaps are actually blooming before they go through winter, If you have the means to put up a high-low tunnel, that's what it's going to take, because blooms will not sustain cold. Again, it's just too much plant matter to be protected by the dorm. I mean, blooms don't get protected if they go into dormancy, and they'll definitely get frostbitten. And I'm a believer in not scrapping anything. You never know what might happen unless you're a small farmer. Like if I was, if this was 15 years ago and I didn't have much space, but I knew I needed flowers, I might consider scrapping it and starting over. But if you don't have to, I would just leave it and see what happens. I would probably wait until cold sets in, and I would cut all those stems like they were being harvested, which is just pinching them and dumping them or doing whatever with them in an effort to save some of the plants and see if they'll winter over. But again, sometimes plants that have really bloomed a lot, produced several stems of blooms, are kind of like on the downside. They are annuals. They live a year typically. And even though their year may span over several, like from fall until very early spring, if they bloom in the fall, those don't always survive unless they're really happy. So there's a lot of risks with that.
Yes. And we should also mention that if you are going to be pinching, you should make sure you're not pinching a plant that is a single stem plant. So if you pinch something like stock, you'll probably be very disappointed.
Yes, for sure.
And something else we should also mention is if you notice that this is happening to you, you're planting in the 6 to 8 week time frame before your first expected fall frost, and you're finding that every single year the warmer weather is going on for longer, right, you need to account for that and adjust for that. So maybe you need to plant closer to the 6 week mark, or even later than that, depending on your particular climate. Remember, when you're looking up your expected first frost date, this is averaging years and years of data. It's different depending on which site you look at, but it's years. So that's actually lagging information. And if you're somewhere where your climate is warming up or the season is getting extended, that may not be reflected in that expected first frost date for quite a while. So that's something you may need to take into account. And always keep in mind that you have a lot more wiggle room in terms of planting time when it comes to transplants versus direct seeding. And Lisa, a lot of times you tend to plant a little closer to the 6 week mark now, and even later than that for your transplants.
Even pushed it beyond that. So the one date that I do stick with is for direct seeding, because direct seeding definitely needs the warmth that we are still experiencing at that 6 to 8 week window. Because, the seeds, even though they're cool season, they need warmth to actually sprout and get the growing going. So I stick to the rules on direct seeding. But you're correct on transplants. Sometimes, we're still planting. We just planted some more Rudbeckia last week, and our first expected frost was mid-November, and this is mid-December. So that was afterwards. But it's because our weather has just changed. There's just no question. But you have wiggle room on transplanting, but not so much wiggle room on direct seeding. And I find that people tend to think it's the exact opposite of that. But you can really push the envelope with transplants.
Yes, I do the same thing too. And if the general consensus is that this was just an off year in your area and it was just random that it was so much warmer, maybe you don't need to change anything, but just keep it in mind going forward. You may need to adjust for changing conditions.
Yes.
All right. Sure. Well, that was our episode for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you're listening in a podcast app, leave us a rating or review. We love to read those. And if you're watching on YouTube, we appreciate a like and a comment. We love to hear what you guys have to say.
Yes, friends. And remember, you can connect with Layne and I and everything else the Gardener's Workshop is doing over at thegardenersworkshop.com. And we love it when you subscribe, friends. So hit the button, and that way you won't miss an episode. All right, friends. Thank you, Layne.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Ciao.
Bye.